Although the Allied nations faced the new year of 1945 with a great sense of hope, there was still a great deal of work to be done if world peace was to become a reality. Adolf Hitler and his Axis powers were finally facing defeat after 7 years at war. But just like any wounded animal in the wild, they continued to pose a very real and dangerous threat. The all-important D-Day landings in June 44 had been an unprecedented success, and the ground forces who'd breached the Germans' coastal defences were steadily moving through France, liberating towns and villages as they went, gathering momentum as they set their sights on Berlin. To say that the Germans and Japanese were out of the war would be premature, but the time was fast approaching when the Axis' reign of terror would be over. As 1944 had drawn to a close, Adolf Hitler had unleashed what would prove to be his last major counter-offence of the war, in what became known as the Battle of the Bulge, fought amongst the French forests of the Ardennes. As many tanks as the German commanders could muster, along with 250,000 men, were engaged in a desperate attempt to push the Allies back into the sea, exactly as had happened at Dunkirk back in 1940, and the fight continued as the days of January passed. Meanwhile, the Japanese were not in a position where they could fight back so fiercely. In the Pacific, the Americans were starting their New Year celebrations by continuing to advance towards the Japanese homeland. On the 1st of January, the US Navy launched more attacks on Japanese islands to increase their superiority in the area by air, land, and at sea. The Japanese were desperately using any means at their disposal to try and beat the Americans back, from kamikaze pilots to suicide submarines. For the Japanese, with an ancient culture that permitted no surrender, they would die with honour rather than survive as prisoners, and this was very dangerous indeed for the Allies. But to make matters worse for the Axis powers, and Hitler in particular, the Russians were already beginning a major winter offensive. They were concentrating their forces in Poland, ready for... Nevertheless, back in the Ardennes, Hitler's campaign could not be dismissed so easily. The Battle of the Bulge had proved a tough fight for the Americans, because the Allies had not had any warning from military intelligence. Even so, once the element of surprise was countered by some fierce fighting, with the American soldiers on the ground enduring some horrifically cold conditions, the Germans were unable to capitalise on their early advantage. On the 7th of January, Hitler withdrew his forces from the Ardennes, and the Battle of the Bulge went down in history as a decisive victory for the Allies when it was concluded on the 25th of January. However, Eisenhower had another battle to resolve in the aftermath, which would take every bit of tact and diplomacy he could muster. After the breakout from the Normandy beachheads following the D-Day landings, the then British General Bernard Montgomery had wanted to take command of operations in France. But Eisenhower had elected to take that very important role himself. In a conciliatory gesture, Winston Churchill had promoted Monty to the rank of Field Marshal, but the tensions between Montgomery and the Americans escalated. When Hitler withdrew from the Ardennes, Montgomery held a press conference claiming that teamwork had won the day, giving no credit to the American generals Patton and Bradley, who had undoubtedly been responsible for the victory. In fact, when Eisenhower had requested that Montgomery go on the offensive on the 1st of January, Monty chose to ignore him, waiting until the 3rd to take action, by which time a significant number of Germans escaped to fight another day. Patton and Bradley threatened to resign if Eisenhower didn't do something about Montgomery, although it's highly probable Monty had no idea how much resentment he'd caused with the Americans, dating right back to the North African campaigns and Italy. In the end, Montgomery apologized, and Eisenhower was able to move forward with all his key people still in place. This was just as well, because after the shock of the Battle of the Bulge, they had to replenish their divisions ready to continue the long push towards Germany. The Allies had lost 81,000 men and over 730 tanks in the operation, but it took just 2 weeks for them to get back to strength. However, for the Nazis, who'd sustained similar losses, the consequences were catastrophic. Not only were they unable to call in reinforcements, the operation had taken troops away from the fighting in Poland. Hitler's last gamble had definitely not paid off, and what's more, had put him under even more pressure of the Ruhr. Yet before they could do this, they'd have to deal with the German troops stationed to the west of the Rhine. On the 8th of February, the Americans began their Rhineland campaign, while the British and Canadian troops headed for the Siegfried Line, a defensive German border that ran from Holland in the north to Switzerland in the south. The American troops were also progressing well in the Pacific, and in February set their sights on the volcanic island of Iwo Jima. This was another crucial island, as even though it was only 8 miles square, it was in a prime location to attack Japan from. Iwo Jima is only 750 miles southeast of Tokyo, and from here fighter escorts could take off to protect the bombers heading for Japan. The Japanese also knew the importance of this island and had 21,000 of their elite soldiers stationed here to protect it. The Japanese considered every possible way to keep the Americans off Iwo Jima, and even discussed the quantity of explosives needed to sink the island into the sea. Because Iwo Jima was so vital to both sides, it became a desperate battle for the tiny island, resulting in serious casualties all round. However, 4 days into the fighting, the Americans sensed victory, and Marines from the 28th Regiment famously lifted the Stars and Stripes on Iwo Jima. With a flagpole made out of a discarded drain pipe, the soldiers hoisted the flag on Mount Suribaki after they'd fought and scrambled their way up to the 167-metre summit. The raising of the flag gave hope to millions of people around the world, and especially to the soldiers still locked in this bloody battle. Everywhere the Marines looked, they could see fellow soldiers who'd been killed, and although the war may have been close to ending, the casualties continued to pile up. Even though the Americans had lifted the flag in victory, the Japanese continued to fight and by the end of the 6-week conflict, as many as 7,000 Americans had been killed, while only 216 Japanese soldiers were taken alive. Back in Europe, the Allies were making great advances towards the crossing of the Rhine. Hitler's attempts to defend the Rhineland were another disaster, and after several weeks of fighting, even the Führer had to concede after losing 250,000 men. The Germans were down to their last reserves, so the order was given for a retreat across the Rhine. Hitler decreed that no bridge should be left intact so as to hinder Allied progress, and when they reached the river, they found almost every crossing had been destroyed. Although this failed to stop the Allies from crossing, it would buy Hitler some precious time to reassess his defences. Unbeknown to Hitler, a troop of disorganised Nazis were caught fleeing an intact bridge near Remagen to the south of Germany. The Ludendorff railway bridge needed some repair, but the American engineers soon got the bridge operational again, allowing men and tanks across the bridge as the Allies quickly surrounded the 300,000 Germans in the Ruhr pocket. Over in the Pacific, the Americans, although victorious, were still nursing their heavy losses on Iwo Jima. However, as soon as they organised a stronghold, they wasted no time in using the island to their advantage. As they continued to bury their dead, hordes of B-29 bombers took to the skies to begin an all-important raid over Tokyo. On the 10th of March, 83,000 Japanese people were killed in the bombings, with over 1 million being made homeless. After these attacks, the Americans planned their invasion of Okinawa, another strategically important island, a mere 340 miles from Japan. The Americans were aware that if the Japanese were prepared to defend this 60-mile island as fiercely as they did the tiny island of Iwo Jima, they would need to be very well prepared. In Europe, the progress of the Allies was slowing down, in part because there was little communication between the Russian troops in the east and the American, Canadian and British forces in the west. However, towards the end of March, this all changed. Montgomery and Churchill wanted to make a push for Berlin, yet Eisenhower took a different view. Churchill was concerned that Stalin would exploit the political advantage of being the first to reach Berlin, and Montgomery believed the Western Allies, who were experiencing less resistance than the Russians, could get to Berlin quicker. But Eisenhower didn't want to risk the lives of his men for Churchill's political gain. Berlin was Hitler's city, and Eisenhower knew that the fight ahead would be bloody and costly. So, to minimise losses and keep the Russians on side, he promised Stalin the grand prize of Berlin, while the Western Allies would concentrate on the north of Germany, much to the chagrin of Montgomery and Churchill. By this stage, in 1945, Germany had lost almost all of the territories gained since the beginning of World War II. Hitler's 1,000-year Reich was tumbling as the Allies now attacked from both sides. The Russians were preparing for their last march on Berlin, yet Hitler still believed that his empire could be saved. And when Joseph Goebbels brought news of the death of American President Franklin D. Roosevelt, he actually congratulated Hitler and told him it was the turning point they'd been waiting for. Roosevelt died on the 12th of April at the age of 63. The whole of America mourned the loss of the Democrat who'd helped lead the nation out of the economic recession of the 30s before turning his attention to World War II. Many couldn't believe that he died so suddenly, with America and the Allies on the brink of victory. And Harry S. Truman, quickly sworn in as the 33rd American president, had a very hard act to follow. The reason for the Nazis' optimism was the belief that Roosevelt held the Allies together, and without him, the conflict between the supposedly united nations could just give Hitler the room for manoeuvre he needed. But the Nazis were clutching at straws. The Americans, British and Russians may have had many different political views, but they were determined to finish what Hitler had started. A few days before Roosevelt's death, the first American troops landed on the Pacific island of Okinawa, and while shocked and saddened by the news, they were determined to honour President Roosevelt's memory. An hour of the invasion, there were 160,000 Americans on the island, and by 10 a.m. they'd already taken control of 2 airfields. The Americans expected heavy opposition to Operation Iceberg, and so gathered a huge invasion force to deal with the resistance of 120,000 Japanese soldiers. But when the American invasion vessels landed, the beaches were strangely empty. The Japanese were clever fighters and stationed the bulk of their men far enough inland to be out of range of the Americans' deadly naval guns, and they gave everything to defend their island, including deploying many kamikaze pilots to attack the invaders. Despite the tenacity of the Japanese, the bigger picture for the Axis powers was about to make their position a great deal weaker. The Russians were so close to achieving their aims in Europe, they announced their intention to join the Americans in the fight against Japan in the Pacific. This signalled to the Japanese that the Russians were ready to attack, and Japan's northwestern borders were now in danger. This was very bad news indeed, as the Japanese were struggling to keep Americans at bay, so speculations that Russia was about to enter the Pacific War caused great concern in the Far East. Contrary to what Hitler and the remaining Nazis had thought, the Western Allies in Europe were continuing to work well together without Roosevelt, as victory was now well within their grasp. Even the most respected Nazi publication, the Schwarzer Korps, the newspaper of the SS, no longer hid the fact that the end was near, acknowledging that it was possible that the Germans could be defeated militarily. The Nazis were much stronger. The Reich may have been disintegrating, but it was fighting to the last man. But by now, the Allies in Europe knew that all they had to do was maintain their advances, and sooner or later the Nazis would fall. The confidence of the Western Allies was so apparent that they now opened another offensive on the Italian front to ensure that their impending victory would be as widespread as possible, and with the help of Germany as he perceived it for a second time in his lifetime. But fortunately for the German population, this was one order that his commanders were not prepared to carry out. As the war was coming to an end, more of the atrocities committed by the Nazis were being discovered. It was back in January when the Russians liberated the infamous death camp at Auschwitz, and the Allies were now making daily discoveries of the Nazi crimes against humanity. Far worse than the dead bodies that littered the battlefields were the gaunt corpses that the Allies found in the death camps. Eisenhower and the other commanders were deeply affected by what they saw in these camps, and if further incentive was required to remove Hitler from power as quickly as possible, then this was it. On the 14th of April, the last push to end the war in Europe finally began. The task of taking Berlin now turned into a race for 3 of the Russian commanders, and Stalin gave them 2 weeks to finish the job. The Russians were well prepared to take Berlin with over 3 million men, 6,250 tanks, and 7,500 planes. The Nazis, by contrast, had hardly anything left to defend their most prized city with. Their mighty Panzer Division only numbered about 1,000 in Berlin, their planes 3,300, and with a meagre 320,000 soldiers, boosted by 1 million German civilians in the People's Militia, there was little hope. Yet the Germans were determined to fight on to the very end, just as Eisenhower had predicted, and the Red Army did suffer a huge number of casualties as they fought a vicious street-by-street battle. With the Russians literally about to storm Hitler's bunker, the Führer's final hours included marrying his long-term mistress Eva Braun on the 29th of April. Although they'd been together for many years, Hitler had always been reluctant to marry Eva, believing that the affair needed to be kept secret so as not to upset his adoring female supporters. But evidently, with no way out of the bunker, marrying Eva Braun was the last act of a desperate man. Then, the very next day, the 30th of April, after a dinner shared with his 2 favourite secretaries, Hitler retired to his private room with his bride, and the newlyweds committed suicide. Eva ended her life with a lethal dose of poison, while Hitler also took poison and shot himself. His 1,000-year Reich was over in little more than 12. Around the city and swiftly moved towards its heart. Berlin was subject to constant shelling from the Russians, backed up by Russian planes to destroy pockets of German resistance. The RAF also helped in the raids, and together they smashed the city, totally encircling Berlin, leaving no way out for the Nazis. The Russians doggedly completed their task, taking street by street, house by house. Not only were the Germans low on manpower, weapons and fuel, by this stage they also had no food, and their only option was to surrender to the Allies. On the 4th of May 1945, in a military tent on the Lüneburg Heath, 3 generals and 2 admirals reluctantly signed the surrender of all German armed forces in northwest Germany, the Netherlands and Denmark. As Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery read out the terms, an extremely nervous-looking German general tried to light a cigarette. Monty, who disapproved of smoking strongly, gave the general a sharp look, and the German quickly and with no argument put the cigarette away. The once mighty Nazi pride had been well and truly tamed. Little pockets of fighting, and the RAF continued to carry out attacks on German U-boats to hammer home the message that the war in Europe was over. And with so many troops already surrendered, peace was literally hours away. At 2:40, in fact, in Great Britain, the population was so keen to celebrate the end of the war in Europe, the party started a day earlier than had actually been scheduled. Western journalists broke the wonderful news prematurely, and VE Day, planned for the 9th of May, was celebrated in Britain on the 8th. To this day, Russia and a number of other European countries still commemorate Victory Day on the 9th of May, while in Britain it's always the day before. As the sun rose on a nation that had survived the threat posed by Adolf Hitler for 7 years, with the promise of peace and the return of all those servicemen who'd lived through the horrors of war, the community spirit that Hitler had failed to break was once more in evidence on VE Day 1945. Tables and chairs were dragged out into the streets, Union Jacks were flying everywhere, and somehow sandwiches and cakes were produced for tea parties, despite strict rationing still being very much in place. The church bells rang out in towns and villages, the length and breadth of the country. But when most people think of VE Day, it's the celebrations in London that first spring to mind. Crowds gathered from Trafalgar Square down the Mall all the way to Buckingham Palace, where the King, George VI, and Queen Elizabeth stepped out onto the balcony to share the joy of their people. Prime Minister Winston Churchill joined the royal family, where he received the grateful adulation of a nation he'd led through the dark days of war into a brave new world. When Churchill gave a victory speech from 10 Downing Street, he managed in a few eloquent words to sum up the feelings of the British looking forward to future peace. He said, "The German war is at an end. Advance Britannia. Long live the cause of freedom. God save the King." Churchill made many announcements throughout VE Day. However, amongst the celebrations, his thoughts turned to those still locked in combat out in the Pacific, where all eyes now turned, and he said, "Finally, almost the whole world was combined against the evildoers who are now prostrate before us. But let us not forget Japan, with all her treachery and greed, remains unsubdued, and her detestable cruelties call for justice and retribution." Peace may have come to Europe, but the Allies were still duty-bound to carry on fighting until an uncompromised peace was achieved in the Pacific, where the US Navy continued to bear the brunt of Japan's refusal to consider surrender. The Americans had lost their leader, Franklin D. Roosevelt, less than a month before VE Day, and as Europe celebrated, the USA was still in mourning for their beloved president. The man charged with continuing the fight, President Harry S. Truman, who celebrated his 61st birthday on VE Day, dedicated the victory in Europe to his predecessor. As a mark of respect for Roosevelt, who'd worked so tirelessly despite ill health to end the war, the flag still flew at half-mast until the end of the official mourning period on the 12th of May. The task ahead of President Truman was immense, and as the true enormity of the situation became apparent, the world watched and waited as history was made. As VE Day came and went, the American forces were still tied down on the island of Okinawa. Since the US landings in April, well over 5 weeks previously, the Japanese had increased their attacks using kamikaze pilots in a desperate attempt to force the Americans off the island. 1,092 suicide bombers had already died for the cause, and it certainly appeared that many more would follow. The Americans, however, were continuing to advance, but at a painfully slow 120 meters a day, sustaining heavy casualties, having lost in the region of 20,000 soldiers since the invasion began. The Japanese were tenaciously prolonging a fight that they had no hope of winning, and with a culture that demanded death with honour, it was impossible to calculate, even at this stage, how long the war would actually go on for. Elsewhere, Japanese troops were now being withdrawn from a number of Chinese ports, some of which they'd only held for a very short period of time. Since the Americans had captured the Philippines, these Chinese ports were within bombing range, and Japan knew that it needed to save as many fighting men as possible, which could be best achieved back in Japan. This was a major concern for the Allies, as fighting the Japanese anywhere was a tall order, but on home territory they'd be even more difficult to overcome. The cost, in terms of Allied servicemen, could be huge, and to gather together an invasion force capable of smashing the Japanese war machine would take considerable time and planning. The Western Allies were also concerned by the Russian involvement in the Pacific. The British and American governments were wary of what the Russians might do if they occupied Japan. There was already enough diplomatic disagreement about the handling of post-war Germany, let alone bringing the islands of the Far East into the fray as well. The relationship between the Western Allies and the Russians had always been strained, but they had at least united in their common fight against Hitler to settle their difference. But now, with Hitler out of the equation, the political differences were now glaringly obvious, with America and Britain being capitalist and democratic societies, while the Russians were communist and authoritarian, and Stalin's record on human rights was equally as bad as Adolf Hitler's had been. Wherever the Red Army was in control throughout Europe, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Bulgaria, Hungary and Romania, one-party regimes under Russian control were storming to power. If Russia was able to take control of Japan as well, the United Nations feared that an end to World War II might not herald a peaceful future, and the threat of fighting breaking out again on a global scale would be a distinct possibility. So the Western Allies faced a dilemma. They had to work together to beat the Japanese, without allowing the Russians to gain too much ground. Stalin had promised that his troops would help the Allies smash Japan within 90 days of there being peace in Europe. Nevertheless, the Americans had an alternative plan they'd been working on for some time. It was a secret weapon that they believed could quickly and decisively end the war with Japan. What's more, peace in the Pacific could be achieved without Russian involvement and with the minimum loss of American personnel. But it was a final solution that would come at a very high price in terms of humanity. In the last 3 years before his death, Franklin D. Roosevelt had supported the top-secret Manhattan Project, which was working towards the development of an atomic bomb. Involving 120,000 people at a cost of $2 billion, the Manhattan Project was so secret that even Harry S. Truman, as vice president, knew nothing about the nuclear program until he was sworn in as Roosevelt's successor. By the summer of 1945, the Americans had 3 atomic bombs ready for deployment, requiring only the go-ahead from President Truman to unleash the ultimate weapon of destruction on the Japanese. By the end of June, the Americans had won the battle for Okinawa, with as many as 90,000 Japanese soldiers having lost their lives. Tens of thousands of Japanese civilians had also been killed, and almost all of the senior officers involved had committed ritual suicide. Losses for the Americans were also devastatingly high, with 7,000 dead, 32,000 wounded, and 26,000 non-battle casualties, many of whom had suffered breakdowns as a result of what had been a truly barbaric conflict. But their efforts had not been in vain. Japan was now on the verge of total collapse. Most of the nation's merchant fleet had been sunk. US ships now constantly patrolled the Japanese coastline. Industrial production was at a standstill, and the constant bombing raids from the Americans meant that internal communications had been destroyed, while the Japanese people were facing starvation. With Germany out of the war, the Americans knew that beating the Japanese was simply a matter of time. But with a proud warrior culture, there was every chance it could be years rather than months. Preparations were made for the Allies to land in Japan using 3 massive invasion plans, codenamed Olympic, Coronet, and Zipper. And although the Americans knew this would bring them victory, the cost in Allied losses could be huge. The Americans only needed to look back to Okinawa for proof of what the Japanese were capable of. Also, they felt the Russians could not be trusted on Japanese soil, leaving President Truman forced to consider using atomic warfare to ensure an unconditional Japanese surrender. On the 16th of July, in the New Mexico desert, one of the 3 nuclear bombs was successfully tested. The bomb exploded with a destructive force comparable to 20,000 tons of TNT, and the light emitted was visible from over 125 miles away. Mankind had produced a weapon like nothing ever seen before. The power that it possessed was unimaginable, and once unleashed, the Americans, as its creator, knew it would change the world forever. Meanwhile in Britain, enjoying the first months of peacetime, there'd already been significant changes, because on the 26th of July, a general election resulted in Winston Churchill and the Conservatives being voted out of power in favour of Clement Attlee and the Labour Party. Winston Churchill, the man who'd epitomised the spirit of the British people in the war against Adolf Hitler, who on the balcony at Buckingham Palace just a matter of weeks earlier had received the adulation of the nation he'd led through some of its darkest hours, was dismissed as Prime Minister. Churchill simply said, "I thank the British people for many kindnesses shown towards their servants," ending an era that would never be forgotten. As Churchill left office in Britain, the recently appointed American President Harry S. Truman had made a momentous decision, giving the Japanese an ultimatum. If they did not surrender before the 3rd of August, America would deploy the atomic bomb. Leaflets were dropped over Japan, stating that people should flee or perish. But still, there were no signs that a surrender was imminent, and Truman was as good as his word. At 8:15 on the 6th of August, the American B-29 Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, dropped the first atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. As the great mushroom cloud billowed into the sky, 60,000 people were killed instantly, with thousands more dying in the weeks to come as a result of burns, injury and radiation. People were scorched in seconds where they stood, birds vaporized in the sky, and entire buildings ceased to exist. For the Americans involved, the bomb had been a complete success, and they were overjoyed at what they'd achieved. At first, there was very little sympathy for the Japanese because of the terrible atrocities committed by their soldiers during so many years at war. After the bomb exploded and the debris settled, the Russians officially declared war on Japan and marched more than 1.5 million Soviet soldiers towards China. But the Americans didn't want the Red Army going any further. With still no sign of a Japanese surrender, the order was given to drop another atomic bomb on the 9th of August. Nagasaki was the second target, and 40,000 more lives were instantly lost in the blast, with many more dying day after day as a result of the radiation. For Japan's leaders, it was dishonourable to surrender, but they could no longer ignore the devastating power of this new weapon. On the 14th of August 1945, the Japanese Emperor recorded a message for the people of Japan. It was the first time anyone outside of his court had heard his voice, and he explained why surrender had been the only option in these words. Despite the best that has been done by everyone, the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. Moreover, the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable, taking a toll of many innocent lives. Should we continue to fight, it will not only result in the obliteration of the Japanese nation, but also it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. With these words, World War II came to an end after 7 years of bitter conflict. Now a formality, American troops landed in Japan and accepted the former surrender on the 2nd of September. With Truman's announcement, this marked Victory in Japan, or VJ Day, and people all over the globe celebrated that world peace had finally been restored. Peace, however, came at a terrible price, and every nation involved in the conflict, whether Axis or allies, would need many years to recover and rebuild. Over 50 million lives were lost in the fighting, with homes destroyed and countryside decimated everywhere that war touched. Europe was awash with refugees, and many of the countries that had been occupied by the Nazis found it hard to rebuild a diplomatic government. Reprisals could be vicious and brutal, as 10 million Germans fled their homes in the aftermath to avoid Russian vengeance. Hitler's years in power had changed the landscape of Europe beyond all recognition, and although the years of recovery would be incredibly difficult, the alternatives would have been a great deal worse. People may have lost everything: their loved ones, their homes, and their personal possessions. But the one thing they'd regained was freedom and the right to live, worship, work, and speak as they chose. It would take years, decades, perhaps even centuries for the wounds to heal. But the words of General Douglas MacArthur, spoken after receiving the official surrender from Japan, expressed what so many were feeling as 1945 came to its historic conclusion. He said, "It is my earnest hope, indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past, a world founded upon faith and understanding, a world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice." And what more appropriate note could there be to end this series of War Diaries on? This journey of discovery has taken us from the outbreak of war in 1939 right through to its conclusion in 1945. Following the twists and turns of military strategy and all the elements of good and bad fortune, there were times when a victory for the Axis powers looked inevitable, as Adolf Hitler appeared invincible. But wherever you look in the history books, sooner or later, those who disregard the rights of their fellow man rarely stay in power forever, as humanity has a unique ability to fight back. In the case of World War II, the lessons of history, as you've seen in the archive films featured, have been recorded for posterity through the viewfinder of a camera, and hopefully in a new media age. They are lessons that'll never be forgotten.